welcome back, everyone. Is the microphone? Okay. Our next speaker this afternoon is Dr. Gregory Stull, who is a resident research associate here at the National Museum of Natural History. Greg earned his PhD from the University of Florida and completed postdocs at the University of Michigan and the Kunming Institute of Botany. He studies both fossil and extant plants, and his research explores major themes in flowering plant evolution. This afternoon, he'll discuss plant migrations and the assembly of the Neotropical flora, insights from the Mesoamerican, Eastern North American biogeographic disjunction pattern.
Hello, everyone. Hello. I'm happy to be here and fill in for the second speaker who couldn't make it, and I'll do my best to be a neotropical botanist today. My kind of current research direction is moving in that direction involving the neotropics, so it won't be too hard. Okay, so the neotropical flora includes over 100,000 plant species, which is a huge proportion of global plant diversity. And the neotropical region is generally viewed as a hotspot of in situ diversification. And this is definitely the case. But the neotropical flora has also been heavily influenced by plant migrations into the region throughout the Cenozoic. And in terms of plant migrations, Mesoamerica is particularly interesting. Oh, nobody could find the button for the... There we go. Mesoamerica is particularly interesting as a region of the neotropics in that it forms a land corridor connecting South America and North America. It also includes considerable habitat diversity, encompassing a lot of elevational heterogeneity across different mountain systems with complex geologic history. Mesoamerican plant diversity, you can see Mesoamerica outlined or colored in black here. It includes part of Mexico and much of Central America. Mesoamerica includes around 17,000 plant species, 3,000 of which are endemic. And in addition to this diversity, it's also a highly imperiled region, as much of the tropical regions are. And for that reason, it's recognized as a biodiversity hotspot because of both its unique diversity and also its kind of threatened nature. And what I'll be talking a lot about today are these very strong but understudied floristic connections that Mesoamerica has with older and more recent mesic forests of Eastern North America. So these are the two main topics that I'll talk about. I'll talk about briefly how Mesoamerica represents something of a refuge for a lot of boreotropical lineages that grew across the Northern Hemisphere during the early Cenozoic. And then I'll focus more on this Mesoamerican, Eastern North American floristic disjunction pattern, which has been very understudied, but I think has a lot of potential as a study system to understand plant evolutionary responses to climate change. Okay, so what is the boreotropical flora? This refers to thermophilic forests that grew across the Northern Hemisphere from around 66 to 34 million years ago. And it includes a lot of lineages that are now found in tropical, subtropical, and warm temperate forests. This flora occurred during a period of global warming. So from about 66 to 34 million years ago at the end of the Eocene, the pools were ice-free for most of that period, and it allowed a lot of thermophilic plants to grow at much higher latitudes. And the more that we study fossil sites across the boreotropical flora, we see that there's a lot of species that are shared across this region, suggesting that plants were able to pretty freely migrate across using land bridges such as the North Atlantic land bridge and also Beringia. And these are just some example plants along the margins here of that are represented in some of these fossil floras. So a few different genera of Icacinaceae, which is a tropical family found throughout the tropics that I studied for my dissertation. Menispermaceae, this is Stephania and Menispermaceae. and then you have cashew down in the bottom left. And then ticodendron and Symplochus are two things that are all found in the boreotropical flora that are kind of unique to, at least some species, unique to Mesoamerica today. So as climates cooled from the Oligocene onward, the boreotropical forest started to deteriorate and was replaced by more distinctly temperate and deciduous forest communities. The diverse tropical and temperate forests of Asia are generally considered a major refuge for a lot of the plants that grew in the boreotropical region. But montane regions of Mesoamerica also represent an important refuge for the boreotropical flora that has been, I think, underappreciated. So here's kind of some different lines of evidence that show that a lot of the boreotropical flora has kind of ended up in Mesoamerica. So there are a number of Mesoamerican lineages that have boreotropical fossil records. So some examples are Terpinia and Staphyliaceae, ticodendron, a few genera in the walnut family, Juglandaceae, Symplochus, Meliosma. Some of these are restricted to Mesoamerica, and others also have relatives in temperate and tropical Asia today. Also in the fossil record of Mesoamerica, which is quite poorly studied, you see some of the oldest fossil evidence of North American fossil evidence of taxa that were common in the boreotropical forest, suggesting that as climates cooled, a lot of the flora was pushed southward. And then in general, there's quite a few flowering plant clades that are disjunct between Mesoamerica and temperate tropical Asia. And this is generally speaking a disjunction pattern that hasn't been that well studied, and it probably implies a boreotropical connection. And I should generally say that the fossil record of Mexico, I'll mention this later as well, is very poorly studied. But it deserves more attention because of Mesoamerica serving as this geographic corridor between North and South America. I think it has a lot to tell us about kind of plant migrations between those regions and across the Northern Hemisphere. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to this disjunction pattern involving plants, species disjunct between Eastern North America, and you just got to press the button down really hard, Eastern North America and Mesoamerica. This disjunction pattern was first recognized by Aaron Sharp in the 40s, based on field work that he did in Mexico with his collaborator, Faustino Miranda. The first documentation of this disjunction pattern was a BSA abstract of botany in 1946, and Sharp and Miranda went on to publish a landmark paper in 1950 about this disjunction pattern. Lucy Braun was another prominent botanist who did some work on this disjunction pattern. And it's an interesting pattern, and it comes in two forms. You have individual species that are disjunct between these two regions, and then you have closely related species or lineages that are disjunct between these two regions, so kind of like above species disjunction patterns. And it's an interesting pattern in that it's very evolutionary recent. So if we think about other major disjunction patterns that are studied, such as pantropical or Eastern North American, Eastern Asian, those are a little bit older. This is more recent in its origin, and I think it has a lot of potential for understanding the origin of mesic temperate forests in the Americas, for understanding how species respond to climate change, both in terms of aridification and changes in temperature in recent history, and then also looking at speciation dynamics in forest species. And also, I think there's a lot of undocumented biodiversity hidden in this disjunction pattern. And so a closer look would be very valuable. We have reason to believe that this disjunction pattern it occurred more or less after the mid-Miocene climatic optimum. I'll talk a little bit later about more precise dates. But as I mentioned earlier, it's a relatively young disjunction pattern. And it was formed as climates were cooling and approaching present day conditions. And just to further orient you, most of you or all of you should be pretty familiar with a lot of plants that make up this disjunction pattern. So these are all things that you would see if you went out in the forest very close by. You have sugar maple, here, sweet gum, carpinus, fagus, Cercis canadensis, redbud, poison ivy, dogwood. And it's very disorienting to go to these cloud forests in Mexico and see these species cavorting with all these neotropical plants. So these are photos of sweet gum and poison ivy that I collected with June Wen recently in Mexico. So it's a fascinating pattern, and a few things that I'll note are that in these two different regions, the distribution patterns are quite different in that in Eastern North America, the populations occur at low elevations and are geographically more continuous, whereas in Mesoamerica, the relevant taxa occur at higher elevations, usually above 1,000 meters, where there's sufficient precipitation, and they're much more spatially fragmented, sort of occurring in like island-like archipelago systems. And this, I think, has important implications for speciation and also kind of phylogeographic or population genetic diversity in Mesoamerican cloud forests. Okay, so check where I am on time. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into kind of what we do and don't know about this disjunction pattern. So I'll talk about the floristics and systematics, so how many taxa show this pattern. And then I'll talk about the evolutionary origins of this disjunction pattern, both from the perspective of the fossil record and molecular data. And then I'll outline some future directions. So previous work documented around 50 species or closely related species showing this disjunction pattern, but there had been no attempt to comprehensively document how many taxa show this disjunction pattern. So me and colleagues have recently set out to do this. It's not we haven't completed the task. I'm sure we'll keep adding examples, but so far we have 72 species that are disjunct between these two regions, and then 28 species pairs or higher level taxa that are disjunct between these areas. And these are just kind of some different examples of either species or species pairs that are disjunct between these two regions. And an important note is that, and just a point about that diversity is that it represents the gamut of life history, traits, growth forms shown in flowering plants, and also it's kind of, they span the phylogenetic breadth of seed plants. And then an important point about the diversity comprising this disjunction pattern is that many of the cloud forest populations might represent distinct undescribed species. And this is particularly true in grapes, hickories, and witch hazel. But this is really kind of an open question. And I think the reason we don't really know the taxonomic status of a lot of these species is because sometimes systematics is sort of defied by political boundaries. And so for example, the flora of North America does not include Mexico. And for that reason, none of the Mexican populations were considered in, this kind of species, the variation of different species included in that treatment. Also, this disjunction pattern includes many species across many different taxonomic groups. A lot of systematists tend to work on particular taxonomic groups. And so it's just a lot of things that people haven't looked at closely, basically. But just to give you a sense of the possibility for cryptic diversity, I'll give an example with grapes, and this is work that Alicia Talavera and June Wen are doing here at the Smithsonian. But there are 3 different grape species that show this disjunction pattern. One of those, the Vitis cinerea complex, recent work has shown that it in fact includes multiple species across North America and Mexico. So 4 species in Eastern North America and 2 in Mexico. And so I think this kind of highlights that if we take a closer look at a lot of these disjunctions, we'll probably uncover, new species, not only in Mexico, but also in our backyard here in Eastern North America. So it's important to take a closer look at these things. Okay, so now let's consider the evolutionary history of this disjunction pattern. When did it form in geologic history? Most of the paleobotanical work on this disjunction pattern has been done by Alan Graham. And so he was a palynologist, and this is synthesizing his work on fossil pollen from East North America to Northern South America throughout the Cenozoic. And what he generally found is that a lot of the common genera that you find in Eastern North American forests have been present in the southeastern Eastern US since the late Eocene, but they don't appear in Mesoamerica until the Pliocene. So this suggests two things. One, a generally north to south migration pattern of these lineages from Eastern North America to Mesoamerican highlands, and two, that this disjunction wasn't formed until after the Miocene. But it's important to point out that there are a lot of limitations to the fossil record. One of those is taphonomic biases, and so, you know, all the taxa that were just listed on that previous slide were all, and as I mentioned earlier, this disjunction includes herbs, you know, not just wind pollinated things, but also insect pollinated things. And so the fossil record is a very kind of limited window on this disjunction pattern in general. And then also taxonomic resolution of pollen can be quite limited. And so if you're thinking about working out species complexes such as the Vitis cinerea complex, it might not give you that much insight on the diversity there. And then another thing can be remedied, and that's just sampling biases. And so the Mesoamerican fossil record is very poorly studied, especially the macrofossil record. And so this is, these are maps of fossil occurrences from the paleobiology database, which is far from a complete database of paleobotany work, but it is telling. You can see in both the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic how there's a lot of fossil collections throughout the US, but very few in Mesoamerica, particularly in the Cenozoic. So a lot of work needs to be done there to understand the evolutionary history of plants in this important region. If we look at molecular data, it's generally consistent with the fossil record. And so this is a plot from a paper looking at the origins of the Appalachian flora. And it shows relevant disjunctions between Eastern North America and Mesoamerica. And all the divergence times are more recent than 10 million years ago. So generally fall in the window of about 2 to 10 million years ago, which is consistent with the fossil record in showing a post-Miocene origin of this disjunction. There have also been a few studies looking at phylogeographic patterns of taxa showing this disjunction pattern. So one of these is sugar maple. And I think these are, you know, very preliminary, but they show that the patterns are quite complex. And I think you know, initially we might assume that the main structure that we're going to find is Eastern North American populations or species, and then Mesoamerican populations or species. And here you can see that's not necessarily the case. And so a lot of haplotypes are shared between some of these Mesoamerican populations and sort of the southeastern sugar maples. The maples in the western mountains of Mexico are more isolated, and you also have distinct haplotypes in different parts of Eastern North America. If we look at liquid ambar in Mesoamerica, we similarly see geographic structure within Mesoamerica. And there's a clear break between across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And so I think there's a lot of interesting patterns of genetic diversity to be discovered if we look at this disjunction pattern more closely. So to kind of summarize this history, available data suggests that this disjunction formed within the last 10 million years, but we don't really have precise estimates. It'd be interesting to know if there were waves of migration involving particular sets of taxa. More work will need to be done to figure that out. And then, as I mentioned just a minute ago, phylogeographic studies, though they're really limited so far, suggest there's a lot of interesting genetic structure within Mesoamerican mountain systems and also within Eastern North America that deserves closer attention. A lot of the previous work has been limited by, for example, the limited fossil record in some cases, or the taxonomic resolution of it. And then also molecular data is pretty limited for this disjunction, and the phylogeographic studies that have been done have generally only used chloroplast loci, usually only a few. And so I think, hitting this with next gen sequencing and getting a lot of nuclear data would be valuable for kind of revealing the patterns. And very few species have been studied in detail, both from a molecular and a morphological perspective across this geographic range. So the main things we don't know about this disjunction pattern, I think we still don't know the full extent of the diversity showing it. We've cataloged about 100 species of seed plants, a little bit more than that, but that's just seed plants. And so it'd be interesting. My understanding is that there are some ferns and some mosses that show this disjunction. Some of the ferns, though, I think are a little bit more broadly distributed, so it's not quite clear. I'm not as familiar with the moss diversity, but actually Aaron Sharp, who first discovered this pattern, was a bryologist, and so he has some early papers on that. And then also, diversity outside of plants. So that would be interesting to look into more. Overall, the taxonomic status of a lot of these disjunct Mesoamerican populations is unclear. A number of them have been variously treated as the same species or separate species, and in general, most of them should be looked at more closely to see what's going on. And then, looking at the phylogeographic diversity across these archipelagos, I think would be really interesting. And also just if we kind of hammer down the evolutionary history of when these migrations formed, and if there was kind of intermittent gene flow, we can kind of start to understand or model how these plants have responded to climate change kind of over deeper time scales, and then also more recently in the Pleistocene. Especially if we think about the sort of archipelago-like system of distribution in Mesoamerica, I think there could be a lot of really interesting things going on. And if you think about how climate's going to impact plant distributions, during interglacial cycles or phases such as now, you're going to have plants, sort of temperate plants at higher elevations. But then during glacial phases, you'll have those plants go down. And then similarly, if you're thinking about Mesoamerica and Eastern North America, glacial phases will push plants southward, and then interglacial phases will push them northward. And so if you think about these glacial cycles, this can kind of produce this complex system potentially of intermingling of Eastern North American populations, Mesoamerican populations, or Mesoamerican populations with each other. But we don't really know if things have been moving around a lot, or if they have kind of remained relatively isolated since the Pliocene. So I think, studying the evolutionary history of this disjunction pattern itself is really interesting, but I think we can also think about this system as, think about using this as a system for understanding the dynamics of, plant evolutionary responses to climate change over, the Neogene, and also more recently during the Quaternary. And then also, I think because there's such a huge diversity of plant functional traits that are found across these disjuncts, it will be interesting to see if we can understand how particular traits mediate a given species' response to climate change in terms of its ability to disperse, its rates of phenotypic evolution, its rates of speciation, that kind of thing. And in general, potentially a lot of undocumented biodiversity in these American temperate forests in Eastern North America and Mesoamerica. So I've been working on this project with June for, I guess, about a year, and also with Lucas Majura, we kind of started to get interested in it and try to understand the extent of it. And we've started to bring in a lot of collaborators, both in the US and in Mexico and Guatemala and Nicaragua. And so hopefully we'll continue to study this disjunction pattern as a collaborative group and kind of try to understand what's going on. Would like to thank the botany department here for supporting this work, and for inviting me to give this talk, and also the botanical garden as well.
Great talk, Greg. I have a question about the another way to approach the origin of this disjunction, which is to look at lineages that used to be in North America not long ago even, but have subsequently now only found in Mexico. I'm thinking, for example, that there's the citronelle flora, which is Pliocene of Alabama, contains something which is probably Podocarpaceae, which is not in the flora of North America because the flora of North America doesn't include Mexico. Have you thought about possibly including, or possibly looking at it from this other angle?
Yeah, I think that would be really valuable, and that's interesting. Podocarpus you bring up because there's actually a prominent Podocarpus species that's found in these cloud forests that has been looked at phylogeographically, and so yeah, and I think early in the talk when I talked about Mesoamerica as a refuge for boreotropical things, I think you're right as well that even more recently there could be things that migrated down and then went extinct and higher north because of glaciation. So yeah, I think you're right that would be a really valuable thing to look at in terms of this problem. So yeah, it'd be cool to chat more about some recent fossil sites. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi there, great talk. So my question is mostly a population genetics question. So looking at that map of Acer that you showed, it looked like the Mesoamerican populations, there were a great diversity of haplotypes in Mesoamerica.
Yeah.
And the northern populations had some subset, which is generally like maybe a pattern that you might expect because of the impact of glaciation. My question is, are there other studies that show the opposite pattern?
More diversity in East North America?
Right. I mean,
not that I know of. I mean, really, in terms of this system, there've only been a few studies, 2 that I showed, and then there's another one on Phagus, and I would need to check, but not that I know of off the top of my head, and also I think that it just hasn't really been looked at too much. So yeah. That would be interesting to know, though. Yeah.
Hey, so we have a question online. Asking, are there any disjunction connections with regards to plants of the neotropical pine and oak savannas and the historic grasslands of eastern North America, including the barrens?
Not that I know of. And this, I mean, that's kind of a different habitat type than a lot of these cloud forests, but there's definitely a large, grass diversity in Mexico, and so it would be interesting to see if some of those things might show that pattern. But I'm not familiar with any disjunctions in those particular ecosystems. Yeah.
I'm curious if you've taken that further down into South America, look at those high elevation floras in the Andes that have these northern temperate kind of things, and how that ties to the idea of the formation of a disjunction, because it seems like you have to have the invasion and then the creation of the gaps in the invasion to make the disjuncts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're saying these things are moving down and then subsequently going extinct, and
yeah, like when they actually make it into South America and how far they penetrate into South America, and then how that fills into the larger story of the vegetation that once covered, of boreal distribution that once covered not just Mesoamerica, but parts of South America as well.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I think a lot of geographic disjunctions, they're kind of fragments of a broader distribution. I mean, if you think about Eastern Asia and East North America, they're sort of fragments of a flora that once extended across the region. So I think you're right that the disjunction pattern is potentially representative of a forest that had kind of a broader distribution and then climate change. So yeah, I think that's very reasonable.